Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, July 30th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of earlier programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war-making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. But this week, the Washington Post carried a puff piece on a U.S. Army veteran who is one of the awful candidates for the Democratic nomination for president, Pete Buttigieg. The Washington Post wrote, how Pete Buttigieg went from war protester to packing my bags for Afghanistan. Months before he launched his first political campaign, he joined the Navy Reserve, adding a valuable credential to his resume, veteran. Bob Naiman, friend of this program, writes, this is pretty damning, and quotes from the article. It was only after Barack Obama was elected, and just months before Buttigieg would launch his own political career, that he finally walked into the recruiting office. Only then did he decide to join a conflict that 6 years earlier he had denounced from the stage of an anti-war rally. This is the man who is cited as the only veteran among the potential candidates for the presidency. Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, is being hyped as the Democratic celebrity of the moment. Buttigieg has been the subject of buzz since 2014, when the Washington Post called him, quote, the most interesting mayor you've never heard of, close quote. Now Buttigieg is running for president, and headlines are appearing in New York and the New York Times, like, could Pete Buttigieg become the first millennial president and the first gay president? Barack Obama has mentioned Buttigieg as one of the rising stars of the Democratic Party. He appeared at a well-received CNN town hall. 538 is charting his the website is charting his possible paths to the nomination, complete with inscrutable diagrams. And Buttigieg has been rising in the polls, even placing third in an Iowa poll after Biden and Sanders. He's still considered a long shot. He's only 37, and no one has ever gone directly from being a mayor to being a president, let alone the mayor of a city half the size of Boise. But of course, we live in strange times, and nobody has ever gone from firing D-list celebrities on a reality show to being president either. So if there's one thing we should expect, it's the unexpected. If you know only one thing about Pete Buttigieg, it's that he's the small-town mayor who is making a splash. If you know a half dozen things about Pete Buttigieg, it's that he's also young, gay, a Rhodes Scholar, an Arabic-speaking polyglot, and an Afghanistan veteran. If you know anything more than that about Pete Buttigieg, you probably live in South Bend, Indiana. Full disclosure here, I lived for a while in South Bend, Indiana long ago, and in fact knew Buttigieg's late father, who was a contemporary at Notre Dame. This is a little strange. These are all facts about him, but they don't tell us much about what he believes or what he advocates. The nationwide attention to Buttigieg seems more to be due to the fact that he's a highly credentialed Rust Belt mayor rather than what he's actually said and done. He's a gay millennial from Indiana, yes, but should he be president of the United States? When he's asked about what his actual policies are, Buttigieg has often been evasive. He's mentioned getting rid of the Electoral College and expanding the Supreme Court, but his speech is often abstract. In this exchange that follows, for instance, a Vice reporter, Vice is a website, pressed Buttigieg to better specify his commitments. The reporter: I listened to you talk today. On the one hand, you definitely speak very progressively. but you don't have a lot of super specific policy ideas. Buttigieg. Part of where the left and the center left have gone wrong is that we've been so policy-led that we haven't been as philosophical. We like to think of ourselves as the intellectual ones. But the truth is that the right has done a better job, in my lifetime, of connecting up its philosophy and its values to its politics. Right now, I think we need to articulate the values, lay out our philosophical commitments, and then develop policies off of that. And I'm working very hard not to put the cart before the horse. The reporter. Is there time for that? They want the list. They want to know exactly what you're going to do. Buttigieg. I think it can actually be a little bit dishonest to think you have it all figured out on day one. I think anybody in this race is going to be a lot more specific or policy-oriented than the current president. But I don't think we ought to have all that locked in on day one. Close quote. This is extremely fishy. First, while there's a valid argument that technocratic liberal wonkery, as it's called, disconnected from values, is uninspiring and useless. The left is not usually accused of being too specific on policy. Quite the opposite. The common critique is that behind the mushy values talk, there are too few substantive solutions to social problems. Why does Buttigieg think telling people your values and coming up with plans are mutually exclusive? Why does he think having a platform means you believe you got it, quote, all figured out on day one? Why treat policy advocates as dishonest? Why mention the extremely low bar of being, quote, more policy-oriented than the current president, close quote? And what use are value statements if you don't tell people what the values mean for action? I've seen plenty of progressive policy agendas that don't sacrifice values. A candidate who replies to this question with this answer should set off alarm bells. But it's not fair to fully judge a person by a single comment in an interview. Pete Buttigieg has just published a campaign book titled Shortest Way Home, One Mayor's Challenge and a Model for America's Future. The book gives a much fuller insight into the way he thinks about himself, his ideals, and his plans. And you may hear some of that tonight at the Democratic debate, which Buttigieg will participate in. The book's been called the best political autobiography since Barack Obama, revealing Buttigieg as a, quote, president in waiting. Indeed, I recommend that anyone considering supporting Buttigieg read it from cover to cover. It's very personal, very well written, and lays out a narrative that makes Buttigieg seem a natural and qualified candidate for the presidency. It also provides irrefutable evidence that no serious progressive should want Pete Buttigieg anywhere near national public office. Before I dive into Shortest Way's home account of the life and career of Pete Buttigieg, let me be upfront about my bias. I don't trust former McKinsey consultants. That's Buttigieg. I don't trust military intelligence officers. And I don't trust the type of people likely to appear on 40 under 40 lists. Apologies to our director, Jason Liggett, by the way, who did appear on such a list recently. But the author of this piece is skeptical of those lists in most cases, and he's probably right. The valedictorian to Harvard to Rhodes Scholarship types who populate the American elite. That also is a description of Buttigieg. I don't trust people who get flattering reams of newspaper profiles and are pitched as the next big thing that you must pay attention to. And I don't trust wunderkinds who become successful too early. Why? Because I'm somewhat cynical about the United States meritocracy. Few people amass these kinds of resumes if they're the type to openly challenge authority. Noam Chomsky says that the factors predicting success in our meritocracy, quotes, are a combination of greed, cynicism, obsequiousness, and subordination, lack of curiosity and independence of mind, and self-serving disregard of others, close quote. So when journalists see Harvard and think impressive, I see it and think, uh-oh. Full disclosure again, I spent some time at what Chomsky calls the Academy for the Passive and Obedient in Harvard Square, and I agree with what he says on those topics. Because the author of this piece writes, I became critical of those institutions after being exposed to their inner workings. If Buttigieg is one of those, great. Pete Buttigieg is not one of those. The first thing to say about Shortest Way Home is that while it's extremely well constructed, it's not tremendously exciting. This is because Buttigieg's life has been squeakily bland and respectable. He was born in an upper-middle-class family. His parents were both professors at Notre Dame. He did extremely well in school and took piano lessons and became the high school student body president. He won the Profiles in Courage essay contest. He went to Harvard. To give a bit of color to the, quote, from elite school boyhood to elite school undergraduate years story, Buttigieg portrays himself as an Indiana hayseed for whom the bustling metropolis of Cambridge, Massachusetts, was an alien world. So even though he grew up on the campus of a top private university 90 minutes from Chicago, the Boston subway amazed him. Quote, my face would have stood out amid the grumpy Bostonians, betraying the fact that I was as exhilarated by the idea of being in a big city as I was by the new marvels of college life, close quote. He claims to have always found something, quote, distant and even intimidating about the imagery of being a student. His dorm was a wonder because it had exposed brick, quote, a style I only ever seen in fashionable restaurants and occasionally on television, close quote. In a ludicrous passage, he suggests that he found the idea of a clock on a bank a wondrous novelty. Quote, looking up overhead, I could note the time on a lighted display over the Cambridge Savings Bank building. I felt that telling the time by reading it off a building instead of a watch affirmed that I was now in a bustling place of consequence, close quote. You can tell time off a building on the Notre Dame campus, too, albeit in analog form. Clock towers are not a unique innovation of the 21st century megalopolis. Calculated folksiness runs through the whole book. On the cover, he's literally in the process of rolling up his sleeves, his collar blue, in front of a Main Street shop front. There's a smattering of exaggerated Midwesternism on many a page. Quote, you can read the progress of the campaign calendar by the condition of the corn, close quote. But okay, that's not unexpected. He's a politician. From time to time, they all have to stand by a truck on a dirt road and talk about corn. The first time I actually became concerned was when Buttigieg described Harvard Square. He writes that when he emerged off the big city subway, caps, his eyes, quote, darted around the lively scene. He mentions the newsstand where you can get exotic newspapers like La Repubblica or Le Monde, and the motley mix of characters he saw, like the teenage punks and someone passing out flyers for quote, something edgy, like a Lyndon LaRouche for President rally or a Chomsky talk down at MIT, close quote. They're the same sort of thing, apparently, to Buttigieg. There's something amiss here, though. These are indeed some of the impressions you might get setting foot in the square. But there's another fact about the world outside the Harvard gates that is instantly apparent to most newcomers. It has long had a substantial population of homeless people. In fact, it's a scene as grotesque as it is eclectic. Directly outside the Corinthian columns of the richest university on earth, people wrapped in dirty coats are begging for a buck or two from passing students. Most of the university population has trained themselves to ignore this subcaste to the point that they don't even see them at all, and Buttigieg is no different. The closest it gets to reporting, quote, a mix of postdocs, autodidact geniuses, and drifters, close quote, at the Au Bon Pain. He doesn't mention seeing injustice. Perhaps just an oversight, though every time I've passed through Harvard Square, it's been my signature impression. But there was soon something even more disquieting. Talking about politics on campus, Buttigieg says, quote, in April 2001, a student group called the Progressive Student Labor Movement took over the offices of the university's president, demanding a living wage for Harvard janitors and food workers. That spring, a daily diversion on the way to class was to see which national figure, Cornel West or Ted Kennedy one day, John Kerry or Robert Reich another, had turned up in the yard to encourage the protesters. Striding past the protesters and the politicians addressing them, on my way to a pizza and politics session with a journalist like Matt Bai or a governor like Howard Dean, I did not guess the students poised to have the greatest near-term impact were not the social justice warriors of the protests, but a few mostly apolitical geeks who were quietly at work in Kirkland House, Zuckerberg et al. Close quote. I find this short passage very weird. See the way Buttigieg thinks here. He dismisses student labor activists with the right-wing pejorative social justice warriors. But more importantly, to this day, it hasn't even entered his mind that he could have joined the PSLM in the fight for a living wage. Activists are an alien species when he strides past to go to pizza and politics sessions with governors and New York Times journalists. He didn't consider, and still hasn't considered, the moral quandary that should come with being a student at an elite school that doesn't pay its janitors a living wage. In fact, years later, Harvard was still refusing to pay its workers decently. If you come out of Harvard without noticing that it's a deeply troubling place, you're oblivious. It is an inequality factory, a place that trains the world's A students to rule over and ignore the working class. And yet nowhere does Buttigieg seem to have even questioned the social role of an institution like Harvard. He tells us about his professors, his thesis on Graham Greene. He talks about how interesting it is that Facebook was in its infancy while he was there. But what about all the privilege? Even conservative writer Ross Douthat finds the school's ruling class elitism disturbing. Buttigieg thought the place fitted him nicely. 9/11 happens while Buttigieg is an undergraduate, and the rest of the book's Harvard portion is spent musing on war and peace. One of the few things that does disturb him about the school is that its students are no longer expected to serve in the military. In an extreme conservative tone, he suggests there was no excuse for a student like him not to voluntarily join the armed forces. He says that he would spend time looking at the names of Harvard students who died in the Civil War, and that, quote, I sometimes paused to recite a few of them under my breath between eating breakfast and going to class, close quote. After the World Trade Center fell, he says, he realized that, quote, the infinite peace of Cold War promise was in fact a mirage, and we would be dealing with matters we thought our grandparents' generation had settled, having to do with war, terror, and freedom. Close quote. Matters having to do with is pretty vague on geopolitics, and his reflections on the war on terror remain mostly at that level. He does say the Patriot Act undercut our freedoms, and observes that the Bush administration took, quote, several quick steps down the slippery slope to torture, close quote. When it comes to Iraq, though, he says something odd. Buttigieg takes pride in the fact that at a rally outside Harvard Science Center, he argued that the Iraq War did not meet the criteria for a necessary war, though he was convinced Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. After Iraq collapsed into chaos as he says. He concludes, we who were against the invasion had been wrong about the weapons, but right about the war. The administration had been wrong about both. Close quote. Hang on a minute, though. Plenty of people who were against the invasion had pointed out that the Bush administration was pulling the wool over the country's eyes. UN Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter was a persistent voice, insisting that Hussein's supposed weapons stockpile was no more. It's odd for Buttigieg to tar other protesters with his own credulity. It's a minor point. A more significant one is the way he talks about war. Buttigieg's thesis was in part about Vietnam, which he calls, quote, a doomed errand into the jungle, close quote. The liberal vocabulary on wars like Vietnam and Iraq should trouble us. He says things like doomed and mistaken, a lethal blunder that collapsed into chaos. His judgment is pragmatic rather than moral. In doing so, he fails to reckon with the full scale of the atrocities brought about by the U.S. government. It also treats America as an innocent, blundering giant with, quote, the best of intentions, close quote. Buttigieg quotes Graham Greene, quote, innocence is like a dumb leper that has lost his bell, wandering the world, meaning no harm, close quote. This is the Ken Burns line. We mean so well, but we make terrible mistakes. It excludes the possibility that American leaders know full well what they're doing, but simply do not care about the lives of non-Americans. And in fact, it implicitly accepts the devaluation of non-American lives. Discussing the dissolution of Iraq into chaos, note a word that obscures culpability, Buttigieg writes of, quote, a reality on the ground that could no longer be denied amid rising American body count, close quote. The Iraq body count, more than 500,000, is unmentioned, just as he leaves out the Vietnamese body count, which was in the millions. The phrase reality on the ground is used without any discussion of what that reality was for those who actually lived on the ground. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're discussing the presidential candidate wannabe, Pete Buttigieg, who will be on tonight's broadcast with other Democratic presidential wannabes in the first of two debates, as they're called, this week. There were two weeks ago, and they're trying it again tonight. Buttigieg, a equivocal and, to my mind, reprehensible figure, is one of tonight's participants. And we're reading an account of Buttigieg's life and positions from the excellent magazine Current Affairs, written by its editor, Nathan Robinson. After Harvard, it's off to Oxford, where Buttigieg takes up his Rhodes Scholarship with pride. This period of the Buttigieg Bildungsroman flits by quickly, but we should pause to note something about the function of Rhodes Scholarships in elite credentialing. Conservative political commentator Andrew Sullivan, of all people, wrote a 1988 article poking fun at this sought-after honor. Quote, there is no more glittering prize a young American can win. And noting that those who win it seem to possess, quote, fecklessness, excessive concern that peasants be aware of their achievement, and a certain hemophilia of character. That's Andrew Sullivan's account of Rhodes Scholarship winners. They're chosen, quote, not for their creative brilliance, but for their slogging ability to make all the right career moves and please their elders, close quote. The Rhodes recipient, Sullivan wrote, is the apotheosis of the hustling apple polisher, the resume-obsessed goody-goody. Honorees often having a kind of bland eugenic perfection. They're good at seeking and getting approval. They were good boys at every stage. They were kind of guys who were editor of the yearbook at a high school or the president of the senior class. From Oxford, he said, the scholars tend to take up unexciting but well-paying professional positions, such as working for McKinsey and Company. Sullivan predicted the Rhodes Scholar could never be president, because being president invokes making decisions, which they would be unable to do. 4 years later, with the election of Bill Clinton, he was proved wrong and right. You can see why Buttigieg was a perfect fit from this line of a New York profile. Quote, for much of his life, Buttigieg has been giving those around him the impression of extreme promise. The impression of extreme promise, rather than the evidence of extremely sound moral character, is what gets you onto those 30 under 30 or 20 under 20 lists. And so it's no surprise that after informing us that he got the highest possible grade in his Oxford course, Buttigieg narrates his next move as follows, quote, knowing I would head back to America meant there was less at stake for me in the grade, but I took pride in it, even while sensing the time had come to learn what wasn't on the page and get an education in the real world, which is why I went to McKinsey, close quote. Okay, pause for a moment. If you're Pete Buttigieg, at this point in your life, you have the ability to take almost any job you want. These schools open doors, and you pick which one you want to go through. Ask yourself, if I could do anything I wanted for a living, what would I do? Pete Buttigieg looked inside himself and decided he belonged at the world's most sinister and immoral management consulting company. McKinsey is in the news almost every week for some new horrendous deed, from advising Purdue Pharma on how to turbocharge OxyContin, an opioid, sales, to counseling dictators worldwide on how to build more efficient autocracies. A former McKinsey consultant recently wrote a long expose of the firm's crimes for the journal Current Affairs. The writer did not equivocate. Quote, if you believe that capitalism's continued practice poses an existential threat to governments, the biosphere, and poor people the world over, then the firm's role is that of a co-conspirator to a crime in which we are all victims. McKinsey is capitalism distilled. It is global, mobile, flexible, and unabashedly pro-market and pro-management. The firm has an enormous stake in things continuing more or less as they are. Working for all sides, McKinsey's only allegiance is to capital. As capital's most effective messenger, McKinsey has done direct harm to the world in ways that, thanks to its lack of final decision-making power, are hard to measure, and thanks to its intense secrecy, are hard to know. The firm's willingness to work with despotic governments and corrupt business empires is the logical conclusion of seeking profit at all costs. Its advocacy of the primacy of the market has made governments more like businesses and businesses more like vampires. By claiming that they solve the world's hardest problems, McKinsey shrinks the solution space to only those that preserve the status quo. Close quote. What we're talking about here is an example of what is properly termed neoliberalism, and the firm at question, McKinsey Consultants, to which Pete Buttigieg allied himself after Oxford, is a prime example of neoliberalism. Pete Buttigieg does not recall his time at McKinsey with a sense of moral ambivalence. Today, he says it might have been his most intellectually informing experience. And by that, he doesn't mean that he saw the dark underbelly of American business. No, he was learning about the nature of data. It was a thoroughly neutral experience, a place to learn. The most critical thing he will say is that he was sympathetic to those who think consulting careers less worthy than public service. But ultimately, Buttigieg only left McKinley because it, quote, could not furnish that deep level of purpose that I craved, close quote. His sense of purpose. Have a look at the book. See if you can find a single qualm, even moment's interrogation of the nature of the company he worked for. In fact, Buttigieg was asked in an interview what he thought of the company's misdeeds. On the work pushing OxyContin, the opioid, he replied that he hadn't followed the story. On collaborating with the murderous Saudi government, quote, I think you have a lot of smart, well-intentioned people who sometimes view the world in a very innocent way. I wrote my thesis on Graham Greene, who said that innocence is like a dumb leper that has lost his bell, wandering the world, meaning no harm, close quote. That's a remarkable misreading of Graham Greene, but that's another matter. The dumb leper again. Man, Buttigieg never misses a chance to cite that thesis. I think it may bother him, perhaps. Vietnam was poor, innocent America, wandering the earth and accidentally causing 1 million deaths. McKinsey consultants are poor, innocent, leprous invalids, too sweet and unworldly to notice that their client is Mohammed bin Salman. Buttigieg even became a bit defensive, suggesting that consultancies might be singled out arbitrarily for ethical judgments. Quote, you don't see blanket denunciations of law firms that serve any number of these clients because the thought is just client service is what it is, and you serve people and represent their interests. But there seems to be a higher expectation of consultancies, close quote. To which I can only say, you'll definitely see a blanket denunciation of law firms if you keep reading Current Affairs, the magazine that produced the article that we're discussing today. Since he was in grade school listening to the adults talk, Pete Buttigieg says he'd wondered, could political action be a calling, not just the stuff of dinner table talk? At McKinsey, he was satisfied and untroubled, but had not found his purpose or calling. After a failed race for state treasurer, he found his purpose in South Bend, Indiana. Here's one thing I keep noticing about Pete Buttigieg. When asked why he wants to hold an office, he talks much more about who he is than what he will do. Here's his passage explaining why he wanted to be the mayor. Quote, the reason to run, the ideal reason to seek any job, was clear. The city's needs matched what I had to offer. The city was fearful of losing its educated youth, and I was a young person who had chosen to come home and could encourage others to do the same. Its politics were mired in the struggle between two factions of the Democratic Party, each with its own candidate in the race. I belonged to no faction and could arrive without strings attached. This didn't just feel like an opportunity, it felt like a calling, close quote. Pete Buttigieg talking about becoming mayor of South Bend. The city feared losing its youth, and I was young. It was mired in factional struggle, and I was a person of no commitments. It was as if I was called by destiny herself. Here's another remarkable thing you'll notice through Shortest Way Home, Buttigieg's book. When Pete Buttigieg reports having meetings with people, it's usually party bosses and advisors, rather than ordinary voters, around whom he often seems uncomfortable. In a city that is 25% black, the most visible encounter he has with a black constituent is an extremely telling one. Quote, a big man who is also a deacon at Mount Carmel, the fastest growing black church in town, he leaned back in his seat and shifted between knowing glances at his fellow firefighters and piercing stares at us. He seemed interested but skeptical. I like what I'm seeing, and I like what you say, but how do I know you're not just another sweet-talking devil trying to get my pants off? It was hard to think of a good answer to that, so I kept on with the pitch. Quote, I don't know about that, but you'll be able to hold me accountable for what we achieved from day one. You could never be sure, but I felt our case was convincing. That's Buttigieg writing about running for mayor of South Bend. The fireman gets it. Pete is a skilled rhetorician trying to get people's pants off. How do you know the fireman is right? Because Pete can't even think of an answer to this extremely simple question. If someone asks you, how do I know you're not just some fraud? And you're not just some fraud. You can say, because I've done X, Y, and Z. I've shown that I'm a person of my word. I have clear plans, and I can tell you why they'll work, how they'll help you, and exactly what I'm going to do to make sure they come about." Close quote. If, on the other hand, you're just some fraud, and your entire life experience up to this point has been going to Harvard and working for one of the world's worst companies, you will flounder. You have no plans, no ideas. You have no record of good deeds in community service. He's got you figured, and all you can do is keep on with your pitch and stammer the word accountability. One thing I find remarkable is when Buttigieg listens to other people, he's not actually listening to them. Check out this little gem from when he's figuring out if he can run. Quote, "I sat listening to anyone who would give me time. The redevelopment commission, first on the list, of course, the head of the local community foundation, the most respected black pastors on the west side, to see what they thought of the city's future and to gauge what they might think of me." Okay, true, he wants to know what they thought of the city's future, in addition to their thoughts on him. But note what he's not asking them. What do you need from a mayor? What should a mayor do, and can I figure out how to do it? He listens to gauge whether he should run, not to find out what community concerns are. Lest you think I'm being unfair to the passage, read the book. Try to find out what those black pastors' political priorities were. Try to determine what the black firemen wanted from a mayor. Pete wasn't curious enough to find out, so you won't either. Spoiler: Pete Buttigieg won an improbable victory and became the mayor of South Bend. And here's where things get very interesting indeed. As mayor, he says, he was tech-oriented. He was, quote, "fresh from a job in management consulting and eager to unlock whatever efficiencies could be found. He wanted to follow the data where it leads." What does that mean? Buttigieg cites app for pothole detection and his smart sewers that use Wi-Fi-enabled sensors to more efficiently control wastewater flow. He was even willing to follow the data toward layoffs. He found that it would save money to put robotic arms on city garbage trucks and fire human trash collectors. Buttigieg was, quote, "prepared to eliminate the jobs," in part because the robots led to lower injury rates, fewer injuries being the predictable consequence of fewer people working. Buttigieg's ruthlessly quantitative approach to municipal government leads an acquaintance to compare him to Robert McNamara, which leads to another musing on the folly of well-intentioned planners. Buttigieg speaks of turning Indiana into a Silicon Prairie, filling the once moribund Studebaker corridor, South Bend was the head of Studebaker automaking, with data centers and startups. He's giddy about the prospect of using machine learning, big data, and artificial intelligence in city government. Buttigieg talks about changing the town-gown dynamic between Notre Dame and South Bend. University of Notre Dame is on the edge of the city of South Bend. Usually when people talk town and gown, they refer to a class divide between the professional university and its working class environs. To Buttigieg, however, it means creating College Town 2.0, a situation in which the college would share its talents with the city. He cites examples of Notre Dame students creating a micro-lending nonprofit for the community and a student group presenting a slideshow on neuroplasticity to a group of recently released ex-offenders. Quote, "This could be the future of what it means to be a college town," he says. All right, so Buttigieg sounds a little bit of a Silicon Valley growth is everything. We can make an app for that kind of guy. So what? Well, so I didn't realize the whole way through Shortest Way Home, his book, that South Bend actually has a serious poverty problem. Over a quarter of its residents are poor. It's not just that Buttigieg is interested in hooking the sewers up to Wi-Fi. It's that he spends zero time in the book discussing economic struggles of the residents of his city. Did you know that there's a giant racial wealth gap in South Bend? You won't if all you read about South Bend is Shortest Way Home, his book. Oh, sure, it takes us on an ambling tour through the city, shows us people kayaking on the old industrial canal, wanders under the railroad bridge, takes us to see live music in an abandoned swimming pool. He tells us about twilight on the river, the fish-stealing heron on his running route. Quote, to some he's a villain, but to me he's an elegant bird. Close quote. But have a look at Prosperity's now racial wealth divide in South Bend report and see if you think these should really be the mayor's narrative priorities. South Bend African Americans make a half of what South Bend whites make. They're twice as likely to be in liquid asset poverty as whites. Their unemployment rate is nearly twice as high. Moreover, the median African American household income level in South Bend is $14,000 lower than African American national average, and they hold an income poverty rate of 40.2%, which is almost 2 times higher than the country average for African Americans. As the report makes clear, the situation for Hispanic residents in South Bend is similarly disturbing. What did Mayor Pete do about this? Well, to do something about it, he might have had to care about it, and there's no evidence from his book that he's ever even thought about it. In fact, as I started reading about South Bend, about getting through Shortest Way Home, there was a lot Buttigieg had left out. The eviction rate has been nearly 3 times the national average, a crisis among the worst in the country. If the word eviction appears in Buttigieg's book, I did not notice it. The opiate crisis, homelessness, and gentrification are all serious issues in South Bend, but Buttigieg mentions them offhandedly, if at all. All of this made me go back and rethink one of Buttigieg's proudest stories. Every time the media talks about Buttigieg, if they mention anything other than his resume, it's his signature initiative to deal with, quote, blight, close quote. Buttigieg says when he took office, there were, quote, too many houses, that the main complaint he received from residents was about the proliferation of vacant homes. His major policy goal, then, was to repair or demolish 1,000 homes in 1,000 days, a number his staff thought impossible. The council president called this an initiative to right-size the city. Right-size is a euphemism from the business world used to make layoffs sound like the simple reasonableness of a corporate Goldilocks. Not too much, not too little. Thanks to his diligent McKinsey-esque management, Buttigieg blew past the goal. But news coverage of the plan makes it sound a little less savory. By leveling fees and fines, the city leaned on homeowners to make repairs or have their houses demolished. In many cases, Buttigieg said, the homeowners proved impossible to find amid a string of active and inactive investment companies. In other cases, he said, they were unwilling or unable to make repairs. Make repairs or have your home flattened? Wait, who are these people who were unable to make repairs? Were they, by chance, poor? Also, how did these houses become vacant in the first place? Were people evicted or foreclosed on? Look a little deeper into the coverage, and you'll find this was not simply a matter of efficient and responsible government, but a plan to coerce those who possess dilapidated houses into either spending money or having the houses cleared away for development. Community advocates in poorer, often American or Hispanic neighborhoods began to complain that the city was being too aggressive in finding property owners over code enforcement. The city leveled fines that added up to thousands of dollars in certain cases to pressure homeowners to make repairs or have their houses demolished. Buttigieg's autobiography does not discuss the social implications of his plan. He brags about his audacious goals and ambitious initiatives, but questions of justice and injustice are absent. And there are issues of justice in South Bend. In places, gentrification is apparently gobbling up more of the smaller, more middle class, and more black parts of the neighborhood. Last winter, the city's inaction on homelessness left, quote, the chronically homeless to camp in the woods as temperatures dropped, and activists say Buttigieg's leadership has fallen short on homelessness. Buttigieg declined to appoint a homelessness czar. A charter school company, Success Virtual Learning Center, as it was called, is trying to introduce one of those most hellish of things, the online charter school, where students sit in a bare room all day being taught by a laptop instead of a teacher. The school-to-prison pipeline is a serious problem, with black boys being suspended and kicked out of school. But community activists aren't characters in Shortest Way Home, and you won't hear about the actions of groups like Community Action for Education. You will, however, hear a very weird story about the police tapes. In the book, Buttigieg defends himself from accusations in a scandal. He talks about having to fire the city's much-respected African-American police chief after the chief was investigated for allegedly blackmailing 5 white officers with illegally recorded tapes of them. It's a complicated scandal. I'm not quite sure I understand it, but there were apparently allegations that the tapes contained racial slurs, and at one point community activists were demanding that Buttigieg be impeached after he refused to release the tapes or disclose their contents. A portion of the book is dedicated to Buttigieg's insistence that he exercise sound judgment, and this should not be held against him. Instead, Buttigieg wants us to focus on his legacy, like, quote, addressing 1,000 vacant homes, staging for the 150th anniversary celebration for the city, and redesigning the 2 major arteries in our downtown streetscape. He imagines traveling back in time to the bustling industrial South Bend of the Studebaker years, more than a half-century ago, thinking about what they were missing out on and what they'd be impressed by if they saw his new improved South Bend with lower unemployment and impressive rates of growth. Quote, those shopping there would never know the simple pleasure of a taco de chorizo, a chicken pad thai, or a California roll, all now taking their place alongside cheeseburgers and a goulash as part of South Bend's 21st century menu. They would surely appreciate the sewer sensor system, the 311 system, the law enforcement technology, close quote. Yes, if the African-American residents of South Bend who came north during the Great Migration could be transported from the 1940s to today, I'm sure they would marvel at the California rolls and law enforcement technology rather than sighing about the persistence of the income gap. Mayors can't solve all problems. What's disturbing about Buttigieg is he doesn't even seem very interested in the problems at all. Someone should ask him, why does his book spend less time talking about poverty than about the time he played Rhapsody in Blue on the piano with the South Bend Symphony Orchestra? Quote, technique sometimes took precedence over expressiveness, close quote, was the review of Buttigieg's performance in the local paper, which sounds fitting. Another type of municipal progressivism possible? Yes, it is. You may not be able to introduce Medicare for all as a small city mayor, though some places are thinking about local Green New Deals, but there's a lot you can do to expand democracy. How about these to start? Quote, participatory budgeting, citywide minimum wage, municipal public banks, social work case management access in local libraries, enforcing strict tenants' rights, lowering the voting age for city elections, kicking out the charter schools, high-quality public toilets and napping benches, safe injection sites and needle exchanges, wage theft enforcement, fighting state attempts to privatize public assets, the right to counsel in immigration and housing court, a co-op conversion fund to buy rentals and permanently convert them to affordable co-ops, a community land trust, free public daycare and universal pre-K, usury caps to keep aggressive lenders out of the city, converting municipal utilities and vehicles to renewable energy, requiring community benefits agreements for new developments, diverting money from policing to mental health services and public housing, and reducing use of armed police officers to solve social problems. That's just a beginning. Creative, committed democratic socialists in city government across the country are thinking hard about ways to create new progressive policies, small and large, using the power of local governments. Not that they object to throwing sesquicentennial celebrations or installing public art or renaming streets, but they understand that in an unequal age, being in charge of a city means being in a real fight for the welfare of people. When it comes to foreign affairs, Buttigieg says, quote, "I did not carry an assault weapon around foreign country so I could come home and see them used to massacre my countrymen," close quote. A strange remark. Assault weapons are fine for shooting foreigners abroad, but not just Americans over here. Perhaps you think that's an unfair spin on his remark. He apologized if it, quote, "came out wrong," close quote. But from Buttigieg's account of his time in Afghanistan, it doesn't seem as if he's thought very hard about American militarism or empire. Buttigieg served overseas for 7 months with naval intelligence, taking a hiatus from his mayoral duties. By his account, it was mostly uneventful, as the U.S. war was winding down, and he spent most of his time either doing analysis at a computer terminal or driving gear through the city. He did not apparently meet a single Afghan who he thought worthy of naming in his book, and the people of Kabul appear as anonymous pieces of scenery. In this respect, they're like the black people of South Bend or the homeless people of Harvard Square, nameless nonentities whose opinions Buttigieg has never sought. Buttigieg spends a lot of his time in Afghanistan Googling things and meditating on why soldiers must die in wars that are largely over. He doesn't have any serious criticisms to make of the military itself, and one can see how he's the type of person who would pronounce himself troubled by Barack Obama's clemency for Chelsea Manning. Remember that Manning publicly exposed U.S. war crimes, a misdeed for which she was imprisoned and tortured. The scope of Buttigieg's self-awareness can be seen from the fact that, in recalling his ambivalence about deployment, he quotes a friend quoting G.K. Chesterton to him, quote, "An adventure is only an inconvenience rightly considered." A morally serious person will realize that one American person's inconvenience adventure is another non-American person's incinerated wedding party. Considering Buttigieg's stance on Israel, totally oblivious to the mass killing and the brutality of occupation, we might worry about his commitment to restraining militarism. Look, perhaps you think I'm being awfully nasty to poor boyish Buttigieg. I already told you I hate consultants. You might think I'm picking and choosing select quotes that make Pete Buttigieg look insipid and burying the parts of the book where he sounds like a true progressive. I can already see the comments. A hit job, a smear, a presentation of all the bad with none of the good. Fine. How about this? To see what Pete Buttigieg finds important, let's look at the index of The Shortest Way Home. Helpfully, it contains an entry for Buttigieg Pete, broken down into all the aspects of Buttigieg's life and political work. Let's see what this encyclopedia of Pete shows. I see a resume longer than a CVS receipt. I do not see anything suggesting Pete Buttigieg is an organizer, activist, or really a left-winger of any kind. Harvard education of, campaign for office of, CrossFit phase of, a lot about bipartisan cooperation, a lot about the city's 150th anniversary celebration, and the, quote, data-oriented city administration. Riding in a car with Barack Obama, symbolic role of, online dating ad, a lot of running routine on Mondays. These are things in the index to his book. Lots about running for positions. No picket lines joined by, or justice for janitors participation of. Buttigieg's book is actually one of the strangest pieces of writing I've ever read by a progressive, self-styled. Buttigieg doesn't even speak the language of progressivism. Justice, worker, the powerless versus the powerful. It's just not in there. Don't believe me? Read the book. Oh, you'll find a cursory reference here and there, perhaps something like the students were volunteering at a homeless shelter, or we need to think about people's lives. In the story about his publicly coming out as gay, he mentioned that he wished reporters would talk about poverty and hunger that were impacting our city instead. But you get a lot more that's completely apolitical. The origins of his husband's tattoos, what it was like to first get Bluetooth, snowflakes on an Indiana winter morning, the biographies of his professors, a former mayor's picky eating habits, etc. There's more about the snow in South Bend than the people of South Bend. By the time you finish Shortest Way Home, you may be thinking what I was thinking. Where the hell is justice? Do you know what false modesty is? I sometimes forget because it can be a little tricky to distinguish between false modesty and over-the-top but sincere modesty. But false modesty is the insincere performance of modesty by an egotistical person rather than excessive self-deprecation by a genuinely humble person. I mention this because I'm not sure Pete Buttigieg understands the concept of false modesty. In this passage, he recounts an exchange with a well-liked City Hall security guard. Quote, Curtis is working security today. In his brown county police uniform, sitting in his usual spot beside the X-ray and glancing at the monitor, he reaches out for our customary handshake. What do you know, Curtis? Not much, he replies. False modesty. He's retired from the city police, and he seems to know half the city. His annual August birthday party brings hundreds of people to the yard of his ranch house. Close quote. Now, presumably, Buttigieg did not intend to insult Curtis here or accuse him of egotism. Everyone loves Curtis. Buttigieg was trying to say that Curtis is a pleasant, self-effacing guy. He's too modest, but he doesn't have false modesty. I bet you're thinking I'm really pedantic right now. Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking. But I keep thinking about Buttigieg's use of the phrase. It was strange because Buttigieg's father was a literature professor, and Buttigieg himself is a meticulous stylist to the point where he has a snobby tendency to note misspellings on homemade signs. He knows everything about the English language, undoubtedly far more than I do. Why do modesty and false modesty appear to mean the same thing to Buttigieg? I think it's because false modesty is a concept Buttigieg would find almost impossible to grasp. Buttigieg is one of those people who thinks Republicans are good folks, whose values you can respect, even if you differ with them. The idea of false modesty requires you to be a little cynical about the world, to believe there's a class of people out there who seem unpresuming, but are actually shrewdly calculating. But Buttigieg didn't notice any of this even when he was at Harvard, the global capital of false modesty. See every admissions essay about one's commitment to community service written by future management consultants. If you didn't notice the Machiavellians at McKinsey, you're probably one of them. Buttigieg might not understand false modesty, but we need to, because otherwise we might think every politician who pulls the "all shucks, I'm just a down-home Indiana boy" routine is just genuinely unaware of their own achievements. We won't see how manipulative it is when a mayor writes their memoir of their humble surprise that a consulting firm was willing to give me an interview for a post-MBA job as a newly minted Rhodes Scholar, and on and on and on throughout the book. I recommend the full article by Nathan Robinson, which appears in the Journal of Current Affairs, and it will be posted on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. You've been watching Aware on the Air, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. We rely on a researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose blog Digital Citizen we recommend highly. We steal from it regularly. There's a link to it on our Facebook page, along with his detailed notes on this program. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others who are truth tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook, my members and friends aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, reminding you that our monthly anti-war demonstration in downtown Champaign at Main and Neal Streets occurs on Saturday of this week, 2 to 4 p.m., Saturday afternoon. And in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.